All right, welcome if you are just joining. The meeting is being recorded and it might be appearing in our training platform, so just so you're aware of that. We'll give everyone a moment to join in, and then we'll start the webinar in a few moments. So just bear with us. Okay, I hope everyone's had a chance to properly join. You're very welcome to this May edition of the Q&A webinar for the GRESB infrastructure assessment. We're really happy to welcome you today. It's going to be a bit of a mixed session, so we're going to have some questions that have come in beforehand, as well as give you the floor to ask any questions that you might have and might be bringing for us today. So let me just go to the next slide. So we'll do a little introduction to the infrastructure team who's present on the call. We'll talk a little bit also about the key changes to the assessments in 2021. Then we'll cover some of those frequently asked questions, and we'll have the open Q&A session. And we'll close off by showing you some of our resources that you're able to use to help you with your reporting this season. So I'm hoping everyone's prepared, but don't worry if you're not. There's plenty of moments to chime in. Should you want to ask questions, though, please use the Q&A function to do so. The team is monitoring that, and we'll be able to funnel all of the questions to the right speakers, which I'll introduce to you now. So on the call with us today, we have Fabio, who's our intern in the infrastructure team. We have Aurelian Reynolds, who is an associate in the infrastructure team. We have David Tassido, who is also an associate in the infrastructure team. And we have with us on the call Ruben Langbroek, who's not featured on this image, but is our head of Asia Pacific. So he technically doesn't sit in the infrastructure team, but he loves infrastructure. So very happy to see you here today, Ruben. And then there's myself, Katie Greneman. I sit on the member relations team, but I'm the infrastructure associate. So any infrastructure related questions can also come to me. Other members of the core group are Eric Landry, Stephen Pringle, Roxana Isayu, and Rick Walters, who are not here today, but you might be familiar with. You've maybe seen them in other webinars or calls. So they're just featured here, so you remember their faces. So let's cover those 2021 assessment changes. So we're really showing you only the high level changes. Obviously, there are smaller changes that we're not featuring. So for the full detailed list, you're really going to have to look at the reference guide, but these are the highlights. So one of the core things is that the weighting of the asset assessment has changed. So as you might remember, the fund assessment is partially informed by the asset assessment of the underlying assets of the fund. In previous years, the weighting between the management and performance component for the asset assessment was 50-50, and this year the weighting has shifted from 40% for the management component to 60% for the performance component. And this is part of a movement of GRESB to emphasize performance over process and management. And it's a trend that real estate has already started. So infrastructure is now also catching up on this. So this will be a big feature this year. Another big change is the integration of the resilience module. This was previously a standalone module and has now been fully integrated into the fund and asset assessment as of 2021. This is, of course, a really key topic for investors and the reason why we included the resilience module in the first place. So we're very happy that those questions are now such an integral part of the assessments as of this year. So these are the questions themselves and how they've been integrated into the fund and asset assessment and the different indicators. Now, please note that the new indicators are not scored. So you'll have this year, if you haven't already participated in the resilience module, you'll have this year to really explore those questions and to understand them better. And they will probably be scored in future years. So that's just a heads up from our side. The leadership questions that have been changed, so they've had really an integration of the resilience component. Those will remain scored, but that resilience component within those indicators will not be scored. So that's how we've done that. That also means that there have been some changes to some of the ESG issues. So as you might be aware, in the asset assessment, the environmental, social, and governance issues really inform how your assessment is scored. So there's been a slight change in that. So 2 issues have been removed, and a new issue, physical risk, has been added, and that will be scored. Now, as of for the Q&A, so as I said, please use the Q&A function to answer, to ask any questions, and feel free to start doing that now. We'll probably won't come to them straight away. We'll first pick up a few standard questions, but don't hesitate to put your hand up if you want to raise anything or ask anything. So please go ahead with that. And we'll start with our first pre-prepared question that came in beforehand. And this is a question we get a lot, and is obviously a very important one because it's about investor access. So a question we get a lot is, can any investor access my assessment results? Now, Aurelien, I think this is a question that's always good to make sure that everyone's really clear about what that actually means, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Katie. So simple answer to this is no, not any investors can access your assessment results. First of all, these investors have to be GRESB investor members. So that's already one important distinction to make. And secondly, our system is designed so that any access request needs to go through a request. So that means that as an investor member, when they log in the portal and your entity is present, they can request an access, and only the account manager of an entity, that means either an asset or a fund, can accept this request to connect. There's also a way to have sort of bottom-up approach. So that means that if, for instance, a fund manager of an asset would like to be proactive about granting access to an investor member, they can also be proactive and look up the investor member that is relevant to them. Now, note that in the case that you're a first-year participant and that you've ticked the grace period, investors cannot request access. So that's also an important dimension to take into account. However, note that for the grace period is only applicable for 1 year. So once you've used that sort of feature, you will not be able to use it in recurring years.
Yeah, thanks, Aurelien. That's very clear. And that maybe ties in a little bit to the next question that we have, which is on access rights for different users. It's also an important one to note because we have a lot of features on that front, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you can see there, we've got 4 main types of users, but obviously the most recurrent one is account managers. So on the left-hand side, you can see a list of the different rights associated with each user type. Of course, the account manager has all the rights. So obviously they can create an entity, edit responses, invite other users. So that's one I'd like to emphasize, because sometimes we do get questions as how do I add someone on my account? An account manager can always invite users and attribute either of these user types. So you can select whether somebody should be an external contributor, internal contributor, and so forth. And obviously an account manager is the only person who can actually submit the assessment. So make sure that when the July 1st deadline comes, that you have an account manager that hasn't just gone on holiday. So there can also be several account managers, something I would also like to emphasize. So there's no restrictions to the amount of account managers that can be on your account, which can be pretty useful because it allows flexibility. So yeah, but typically we also have the investor relations manager. So the 2 rights that I omitted from this user is the ability to invite users and submit the assessment. Another popular one we have is internal contributor. This is typically used for consultants, for instance. And typically they can view reports, edit the response to the assessment, upload documents, but they don't necessarily have access request views or don't have the ability to invite users or submit the assessment. And then finally, we've got the external contributor, which is the lowest, or the user with the lowest amount of rights. So yeah, I think that's it on this side.
Yeah, definitely. And it's the benefit of the system as well, is that you can make as many users as you can. So you can, invite as many people as you want and just make sure they have the right access rights so they don't accidentally delete part of your assessment or something like that. So that's a really nice feature I think we have. So we already touched on it a little bit, the grace period. So investors won't be able to request access to an entity if it reports in the grace period in its first year, but we'll still get a benchmark report. We'll be benchmarked against other entities.
Sure. Yeah, I can answer this one. Sure. So indeed, a grace period participant will still be benchmarked. It will still obtain the benchmarking information. So that's pretty crucial. So but yeah, indeed, an investor will not be able to request access. When it comes to a fund that is connected to an asset specifically, so let's say that the fund is participating and submitting to GRESB, but one of their underlying investments or asset is under grace period, then the fund will not be able to access the underlying assets report unless, of course, if their user in that same asset. But typically, if a fund requests a connection to your asset because they use the score, then they will not be able to see the score or the report of the underlying asset.
But the score will be featured right in the fund, so it will still contribute. They just don't know what part is from the new asset.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. The score of the asset, even if under grace period, will still contribute to the performance score of the fund.
Yeah. Perfect. Always good to know, and it's a really great feature for first years because it really allows you to explore reporting to GRESB and spend maybe a little bit more time making a few mistakes potentially, and without really penalizing your assessments too much. And you can really use that as a sort of starting point on your GRESB ESG journey. And we find that second year participants really get a massive uptick in their score because they really understood after this first year what they're doing, and it's really why we offer that grace period in the first place. Now, relating to starting off assessments and understanding what a good way of reporting is a question we get a lot on the asset assessment is when there are multiple facilities or assets in different locations and whether it's possible to group them into one assessment. So this question that we've got is, we have multiple locations within the same sector across 4 different European countries, which we manage as one group. Should we report as one asset or as 4 independent assets? Now, Aurelian, what would you say to the people who've asked this question?
Sure. So typically, we would recommend that people report assets by country. So that means that in this specific case scenario, typically because we would suggest having the best benchmarking information available, if an asset is scattered across different countries, we would recommend that you create an asset assessment for each of the facilities that are located per country. Now, in the case, for instance, that we've got several scattered sectors that are scattered over one region, for example, and that is typical in some cases where there's a diversification of assets between the waste sector, for example, then it would make sense to cluster them under one assessment. But typically, we would recommend this on that regional level. But when it comes to differences across countries, we would recommend that you report as one assessment for each. And that's typically for you as well, is to get the most out of your benchmarking information and to be able to make the best comparisons possible. We also sometimes get this question in relation to, well, I have a diverse asset class. How should I report? And once again, it also comes to this idea of benchmarking, because the more facilities you diversify, the more the likelihood is that your primary sector will also be diversified, and hence you lose this level of granularity in your benchmarking information, which doesn't quite provide the necessary value. So we would recommend that, if you have different sectors within your asset, that you at least make sure that your primary sector is granular enough to get meaningful comparisons out of them.
Yeah, that's a really key one, the meaningful comparisons, because that's ultimately what you're doing your GRESB reporting for, is to get some results that are really beneficial to understanding where you are when it comes to ESG. Now I've taken a look at the question and answer feature, and I haven't seen any questions yet. So if you are watching and you have a question, don't hesitate to raise it, because we have some pre-prepared questions, but this session is really also meant to offer you the opportunity to become interactive and to really ask us anything you would like to know, because you have the full expert team on the line here. So I would urge you to make use of their knowledge. But for the time being, we'll continue with some of those pre-prepared ones, and I'll keep an eye on the Q&A. So this next question we get is another one that's probably quite relevant to a lot of the people who are working in a non-English speaking country, which is on language requirements. So let me just make sure I get to the next slide. There we go. So the question we get asked a lot is, my evidence is in a different language than English. Can I still use it for my GRESB submission? Now, David, this is obviously a really key one, right? Because if you have a very long policy document of 100 pages, do they need to translate the entire document, or is it still possible to use that?
Yeah, so this is also a very typical question. Essentially, in a nutshell, the answer is that no, you do not need to translate the whole document. All that GRESB looks for is at least a summary of the relevant parts of the document translated in English, which you can add to the text box of your answer within the portal. Or additionally, what you could also do is highlight the different areas that are relevant in the document for the validators to look at and provide small translations within the document. So fundamentally, what the validators are really looking for are for the elements within the portal for the indicator that you have selected or the claims that you are making. Is there a translated supporting piece of sort of evidence or accompanying text? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really key thing, isn't it? Because the validation team is really trying to make sure that what's being said in the assessment matches the evidence. So, and they're speaking English, so that's what they really need to be able to do, is to, even if they can't understand the language of the document, still making sure that everything that's being said and indicated is actually in that evidence piece. So that's really key. Now, similar question on evidence. So a lot of people ask us that, you know, if you have several reporting entities, what's the best way to start reporting? So the question here is, several of my reporting entities share similar responses, including evidence. Is there a quicker way to upload documents for multiple assessments? So this might particularly apply to funds that share a fund manager, where there's an overarching policy that applies to all the funds, or the same way for an asset manager with multiple assets. So David, can you tell us a little bit about that template function?
Yeah, so this is a very typical scenario, particularly within the management component, not performance component. So within the management component, you do tend to see, as you mentioned, you know, managers who may across multiple assets, or operators who will have the same policy, for example, applied across the board. And so within the portal, in the tab that is the assessment portal tab, where you can see the list of your entities, on the right-hand side, you should see an option to manage templates, which will bring you to the screenshot that we've presented here. And from here, you can essentially open up an assessment, if you will, a draft assessment. You can fill it out for all the indicators which are templatable. And then you can apply this template to the entities that you wish, and it will just essentially apply a copy paste across the board of the indicators that you filled out in this template, including the evidence as well.
Yeah, that's a real time saver. So this is a top tip, I think, for a lot of participants who don't maybe realize that that function exists. So thanks for sharing that, David. And I think there's also a lesson on it in the training platform, right? If people want to explore this at leisure.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So another question on evidence we get a lot is, in some instances, there may be the case that there are things covered by law already. So maybe you don't have a specific policy on a certain topic. So the question here is, we are required to cover certain ESG issues such as child labor by law. How should we report this under the risk management and policies indicators? And what's the typical response you give someone who asks this question, David?
Yeah. So in general, indeed, this is can be quite often the case in developing markets whereby the entity already has specific technically social and governance issues that are covered by law. So what we generally advise is to at least provide some evidence that the law or some sort of procedure is taking place within the entity and its operations to abide by this law. Because at any moment where you simply state or refer to a government website saying that this is a law in the country that we operate, validators, at the end of the day, regulations, the way that you apply the process to abide by the regulation is what the validators fundamentally want to see, be it through policies or different risk management processes. So to stay on the safe side and make sure that you're not losing unnecessary points, we highly advise entities to at least, if they're only referring to a law, to at least try to explain it and show how they apply a process to deal with that regulation internally and in their operations.
Yeah, exactly. It's again about making sure the validation team can confirm that what's being said is true, and they can really check that evidence accordingly. I see there's a question come in, a few ones on the chat. I would ask you to please use the Q&A function if you can, because that makes it a little bit easier for us, but we'll pick those up in a second, because I have one more question on evidence, and then we'll get to those questions that have come in on the chat function. So just to finish that evidence query session, and this maybe ties in a little bit to what we just talked about with the templating tool, David, so we probably can keep this quite short. But say an entity has evidence at the fund manager level for the fund assessment, can they still submit that evidence?
Yeah, also another very typical scenario. So from the most important thing to note again is that the validators in this case want to see that whatever document you have appended to your assessment is indeed relevant to your entity at the end of the day. And so if you're looking if you're looking to have, hold on, let me just look at the question again. So yeah, if you're looking to have a manager providing the fund with evidence, you can fundamentally provide that. However, we do look for some information, whether be it in the cover letter or in the summary that the summary text that you append with either the evidence or within the portal, to state or explain this relationship, because in some cases, of course, the fund manager name is almost identical to the fund names. However, in some cases it's not, and so we need to make sure that for the validators you make this link clear, so that they don't accidentally or unnecessarily rather reject the evidence piece due to lack of a clear link between the manager and the fund entity that is reporting.
Yeah, very true. Thanks, David. So thank you for sharing some of those questions on the Q&A. So we'll pick up the first one from Vivek. Vivek asks, hi, indicator HS3 requires the entity to report on the health and safety performance of its users. What is the difference of HS3 with HS1 and HS2? So for a reference, HS1 is on the health and safety of employees, and HS2 is on the health and safety of contractors. Aurelian, do you want to answer this question?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So first of all, thank you for your question, Vivek. So indeed, so the distinction is made indeed between HS1, which is focused on employees, and HS2, which is focused on contractors. So this might bring you to the question, well, what is the health and safety of users? And so users are typically people who directly interact with the asset. And as a practical example, we can, for instance, let's take an airport. And the airport terminal, the passengers that directly interact with the assets are the users of the asset. And it's very straightforward typically for any sort of the transport related sectors that have passengers, right? These are the people that aren't employees and that are not contractors, but directly interact with the assets. So, of course, for solar panels, for instance, it is unlikely that people are just going to roam around the solar field and I don't know, pick some daffodils. They won't directly interact with the asset as such. And just as a reminder, this indicator is driven by the GRESB materiality assessment under indicator RC7. So it typically asks you what are not the number of users that interact with your asset, and this will determine the level of relevance or materiality for this question.
Yeah, certainly. And the key here is really the physical interaction, isn't it? Because that's exactly what you say. You might have end users if you're a solar farm with end users using your generated electricity, but they don't actually physically interact with the asset. So that's a really key one. So that's the difference, Vivek. I hope that answers your question. I see there's a few more that come in, so thank you very much. Keep them coming. You've got your chance now to ask David and Aurelian anything, so I would urge you to take that opportunity. So Adam has asked, we have changed a business name during the reporting period. Should we be using our old business name or a new business name when uploading evidence? For example, policies and procedures in either the old company name or the new company name. David, is this a question you'd be able to answer?
Yeah. So in this case, it comes down to simply making sure that whichever name you choose so the name that you choose in EC1, so the first indicator of the assessment, whereby you state your legal name as well as any operator names. Just make sure that the documents that you are attaching as evidence throughout the assessment are sort of from the same name as what you have listed in EC1, simply because, again, from the validator's perspective, they're just looking to make sure that there's a clear link between the legal name of the entity that is reporting and the evidence pieces that are supporting it in turn. And so whether you select whether your name changed throughout the reporting period, you'll just need to make sure that you stay consistent. So you select one of the names, and then all your evidence pieces are consistent with that naming. So I would suspect that most of the evidence would be with the old name, and so it's a question of in EC1 using that name. And in future years, if you need to change the name, for the sake of the assessment, that's totally fine. And you'll have the time to make the changes to the documentation and the name to the name in which all the evidence pieces are written to.
Yeah,
the entity that they refer to. Yeah.
And David, maybe just to add to that, in the case that you do have, for instance, a policy that does have the old name, but you're indeed using the new legal entity name, you can also provide a context into the evidence pieces, explaining that in this particular case, the old name of the entity is present, but the relationship is that the entity has changed names, so as to not confuse our validators as well.
Correct. Yeah, well, that's always a good tip. Always, if there is doubt and you think there might be some clarity that's missing, just explain it in the cover letter or in the supporting text for validators to be able to see.
Yeah, better over-explain than under-explain is definitely a good tip, I think. Thanks, David. And Aurelian, of course. And we have another question from an anonymous attendee. So feel free to share your name unless you really don't want to, but we always like to see who's asking the questions, because then we kind of know maybe we have had some contact with you already, so we can always makes it a bit easier for us to follow up if necessary. But the question asked is, under the management component for a company that has operations across multiple jurisdictions, do they submit evidence for each of their operations or for the primary company? For example, corporate stakeholder engagement plan versus entity stakeholder engagement plan. David, are you also able to answer that question?
Yeah, sure, I can try. So again, in this case, it kind of comes down to, as Aurelian was mentioning earlier, the way that you decide to break down the entity and how you're reporting it. So I'll try to answer from the two perspectives. If you have broken down the company and its operations across the multiple jurisdictions into individual assets, Then for each of the individual assessments, you'd want to be submitting evidence pieces for each of the operations at the company level. And in the case where you have combined everything under one general holding company, and all the jurisdictions and their operations are being reported as individual facilities, in that case, in theory, you could report at the more, say, group level. However, evidence at the sort of company level of the individual companies operating in their individual jurisdictions is also completely fine to provide, and probably it is better in terms of if in the future you do want to make the split between different assets, if you don't have the resources to report multiple entities currently. You would have all the documentation sort of set up already within the portal. It would just be a question of splitting it to across the different entities for the different jurisdictions in future years as separate assets. I hope that makes sense. If it's unclear, feel free to send us an email.
Yeah, and I keep them coming with the Q&A questions as well. So thanks, David. That was, I think, very clear for me. Yeah, again, with evidence, make it as abundantly clear as possible what you're trying to establish, what you're trying to sort of prove within your assessment, so that you make it as easy for the validation team as possible. And that's definitely the way to success, I always think. So good advice there. Thank you. So again, please keep sharing your Q&A questions. In the meantime, we'll have a few more prepared ones to go through. So one thing we've obviously been asked a lot this year is on COVID-19 and the impact that has on reporting especially of quantitative performance data. So if you were participating in GRESB last year, you might remember that we had an extension of the deadline for the reporting, mainly because we knew so many assets were being impacted with employees being furloughed and things just being in a general state of chaos. I mean, we've all experienced it. So that kind of changed the reporting season a bit last year. This year, we won't be doing an extension, but the question we do get asked a lot is whether the impact of COVID-19 will impact the quantitative performance data scoring. So Aurelian, this is something that obviously concerns people. What would you what answer would you give to this participant?
Sure, thanks, Kelly. Yeah, so as Kelly said, we obviously understand the impacts of COVID-19, and at present, at least, we do not score the performance data. So that means that we mainly score transparency over reporting. So that's what we're most interested about. Obviously, we do conduct some outlier checks to see certain variations, but of course, we're very aware of the disturbances that COVID may have caused throughout the year. So we'll be, how can I say this? We'll be fairly open-minded as to these variations, but there's no problem in terms of fluctuations in the data itself or the absolute performance of the asset, especially in terms of intensity metrics. It's really the ability to report is most important. And if in some cases, of course, there has been issues with data collection, feel free to use the context box to provide further detail as to why there has been fluctuation or why say data points are missing. This will always help better understand what is going on, because obviously GRESB will probably like to start scoring performance in the future. And so the more context we can get, the better understanding we can get in terms of this data, the better for us it will be to pave the way to score performance appropriately in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Aurelian. And we have another question we get asked a lot on performance data, which is about the tables in the performance component in the asset assessment. So these may seem a little daunting if you're reporting to GRESB for the first time with all the different colors. And people ask us oftentimes whether they should complete all the cells in the table Now, David, what would you say to that? And I've added a slide where it kind of explains the key. So maybe you can run the group through this for a moment.
Yeah, sure. As shown on the slide, effectively, you do not need to report every single cell in every single table within this performance component. What we do look for is, at least as you can see there with the solid lines with the dark outline, you have mandatory cells. So those are the ones that you need to report on in order to be able to select yes to any indicator. Any cells with gray outlines are optional. Light green or blue shadings or orange tend to be scored. So why we have that differentiation between light green or orange shading applies to particularly in the indicator EN1, for example, whereby depending on the sector that you belong to, different rows actually get scored. And so if you want to see an example of how that works, you can go take a look at EN1. And lastly, cells with pre-filled number values. So as you start filling, you'll start seeing some cells that start to automatically populate themselves, or any cells with NA stated within them are cells that are automatically calculated by the portal as you go along.
Yeah, so in this example, the calculated cells are water reused, right? So the percentage water reused is calculated automatically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the scored metric here is the total discharge to sensitive waterways. So that's the one where you will need to complete all the cells to get the full point. So that's always a good heads up. It's not mandatory to report the targets for the scored metric, but you might be scored on them. So that's just one to bear in mind.
Sure, Katie, do you mind just going back on the slide?
Yeah, sure.
There's also something I just want to emphasize as well. I just want to emphasize that obviously the mandatory metrics are groundwater, seawater, brackish water, surface water, third-party reuse, third-party treatment. And when it comes to total discharge sensitive waters, if you have a look at that specific row, please note that the blue outline, right, or the blue fill, sorry, blue fill, not the outline. There's also the reporting year target and the future year target. And these reporting year targets form 40% of the score. So don't forget to report on them, especially.
Yeah,
they are important. So that's just something I want to emphasize, because often people just have a look at the reporting year performance and just fill in this shade. We only want people to report a target in relation to total discharge to sensitive waterways. Sometimes you can extrapolate or use other targets in order to inform this specific metric. But yeah, in order for you to obtain a full score, you also need to fill in a reporting year target for the row total discharge to sensitive waterways and future year target for total discharges to sensitive waterways.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Aurelian, for adding that. Great. I don't think there's any new Q&A, so I sort of preemptively already went to the next slide, so I hope that's okay. So spoiler alert, not one. But one question that's also that also comes across our desks quite frequently is on certifications versus management systems. And this is really one where that trips up a few people, because ISO is typically called a kind of certification, but GRESB doesn't accept ISO as an ESG certification under CA1 certifications in the performance component. David, can you explain why that's the case?
Yeah. So yes, a very typical question to come through. So effectively, let me start with in CA1, what are we really looking for? And effectively, what we are really looking for is a certification that pertains specifically to the facility or the asset, the built asset itself, the physical asset. And in that sense, what we're looking for is a certification that has themes that are related to sustainability and applied to infrastructure facilities or assets. And you can think of cases like there's some bigger names like BREEAM, for example. These are built, when you have a certification from these schemes, your building itself is certified for particular efficiencies. It could be energy, it could be GHG emissions. So it really needs to have to do with the physical infrastructure itself. And in many cases, the ISO, first of all, we have an indicator specifically that rewards participants for having ISOs, which is RM1, which has to do with different management systems. And when you try to apply this to CA1, well, it would be a double counting, but B, usually ISOs have to do with the process, the management process of how you run your operations. They don't have to do with retrofittings and technical specifications of the built infrastructure. So that's why we draw a line between the two.
Very clear. So I hope that clarifies some questions. And obviously the two can be interlinked, right? It might be that as part of your ISO certification to have an energy management system, you're making some physical changes to the building, but that's still a process. And even if it changes the building a little bit. So thanks for that clarification, David. Very helpful. At least I found that. So we'll go on with a few more questions that we have prepared and that came in beforehand. Again, please do share them in the Q&A if you have any, and we will address them. As you can see, there's space to do so, so don't hesitate to put your hand up. So another question we get a lot is, and this is maybe one for Aurelian, it's about the scoring of non-material issues. So a question we get frequently is, we are required to report on an ESG issue, but we don't think it's actually relevant to us. So this is an entity who's done the GRESB materiality assessment in the beginning of the assessment in RC7, and has found perhaps that the outcome of that is that there's a certain issue that they don't agree on the level of materiality for. Will this entity still lose points if they don't report on it, Aurelian? What should they do?
Sure. So if indeed the GRESB materiality assessment has found that an issue is material, and typically the outcome means that it's of medium or high relevance, and you not report on it, then indeed you will lose out on some points in a specific case scenario. However, of course, all of these material issues are informed and reviewed by industry and our governance groups. So if you do have feedback and you do disagree and have a legitimate reason for this disagreement, we have the GRESB materiality and scoring tool, whereby there's a specific process that you can provide us with your feedback, explain exactly which issue and which outcome you disagree with, explain to us what you believe the level of relevance it should be, but also providing, of course, a justification. And at the end of the year, we collate all this feedback, we'll bring it to our governance group, go for thorough discussions as to, whether this materiality outcome should be changed. And then typically, if it was a valid change, then it will be applied. But in some cases, of course, if the case is not strong enough or the governance groups disagree, then it will remain typically the same. So we think that over the last 3 years, we've been able to refine materiality pretty well. But of course, we're always open to feedback and different points. So yeah, please check the materiality and scoring tool. There's a whole process in relation to it, and we're more than happy to take into account feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can assure you, I've been sitting in some of those meetings with where the governance group discuss materiality, and I can promise you that it goes quite deeply. There's a very thorough discussion. So your feedback is very much welcomed on that front. So please do share it with us, and it will probably end up with Aurelian. So he'll be very glad to receive it, I'm sure. Thanks, Aurelian. So this is really the part of where we finish our pre-prepared questions. So please use this opportunity. I can't stress it enough. You've got David and Aurelian on the call, and they are our top experts, and they will answer any of your questions right this instant. So please raise your question through the Q&A now that you still have the chance. If you don't, we will just continue and discuss the resources, and we'll conclude the webinar. But if you do have any questions, this is your very last chance almost to ask them before we move on. So I'll just wait a moment. If anyone's typing, they can do so now. But we will obviously, once we get past this, we'll talk some of the resources and how you can get in touch with us if you still have anything that's sort of comes to you after this webinar, or things that you maybe been afraid to ask potentially. We have a really helpful team that's ready to answer any queries. So and the way you can get in touch with them, we'll show you in a moment, and some of the other handy resources and tips to get the most of your GRESB assessments in a moment. Now, I don't see anything coming in, so I'll just move on to the next slide. If something does pop in, we'll still answer it, of course, but I'll move on to the research. Perfect. One last question. Thank you very much, Vivek, for that. So Vivek has asked, is it mandatory to undertake ESG insurance for schemes mentioned in Appendix 11? David, would you be able to answer that question for Vivek?
Sure. So I'm not 100% sure I fully understood the question, but effectively the ESG assurances that are offered in Appendix 11 and in various indicators throughout the assessment, if you do select it in any of the indicators, so for example, you know, in cases whereby you selected for various indicators and you tick one of the schemes from the list, it is expected that the scheme has been sort of undertaken and assured by the entity. So in the case of RP1, which has to do with, you know, if your sustainability report has been assured or verified, then the validators will look to make sure that the certification of the assurance is attached in the supporting evidence as well, either as part of the sustainability report, sometimes you append it right at the end, or as an accompanying individual piece of evidence. I hope that was the question.
Yeah, I think so. Vivek, please let us know if that's indeed what you were trying to ask, and if you have any other questions, then do share them. Otherwise, I'm going to select this as resolved. So thank you for asking that. Any other Q&As will just come in as we move along. We'll still answer, but I'll proceed to the resources now so that you can get the benefit of seeing what's actually available other than obviously this session. Let's see. So we have a lot of documentation on our website, which may seem a little daunting, but trust me, everything you might need is probably there. And if it isn't, please let us know. We might be able to add it. So some of the ones you really want to be looking for are the reference guides, which obviously are contain any kind of information on the assessments, any background on the questions, provide references to some of the indicators that are aligned with GRESB and vice versa. So GRESB obviously aligns to a lot of external ESG frameworks. So for example, if you're already reporting to GRI or CDP, you might be able to use some of that in your GRESB reporting. So this is a really key feature of GRESB, is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel and we don't want to make you do double work. So that's a really useful thing to look at. We also have our scoring documentation to help you understand where and how points are allocated. The indicator summary, so that's just simply an overview of all of the indicators in the assessments. The assessments are also available in Excel format. You can't upload them or use them in the portal, but they can be a really good feature if you want to share it internally within your company. You don't want to give everyone access to the portal, or to even do a practice run. So have a look at that as well. We have our sector allocation matrix, which will help you understand the various ways that we allocate peer groups. The materiality and scoring tool that Aurelian's already mentioned, which is open for you to also provide feedback on. And we have, as of a few weeks ago, we have a new document on Scope 3 guidance for your GHG reporting. So if you're looking to do GHG reporting, or if you are looking to do Scope 3 reporting, that's a really good one to check out. Now, I see there's a question that's actually just come in over chat from Claire Baldwin. Hi, Claire, thank you for your question. Claire has asked, can you talk more about how you decide whether to report a company with various assets across different countries at the group level or as separate entities? What advice do you have? So this is related, obviously, the question we've seen earlier, Aurelian, on asset grouping. Would you be able to give Claire some advice there? And maybe we need to take some of that conversation more sort of in a separate discussion. So Claire can, if you have a specific situation that you want to have some advice on, we might be able to talk to you separately. But in general, what would you say here, Aurelian?
Sure. So earlier I mentioned that typically, if you want to have most granular information and the most value out of your benchmark, it's probably best to separate your assets between countries, but also subsectors. But I suppose another tip I can provide is simply have a talk with your fund managers or your investors. Typically, they also have an idea of how they would like you to report, especially if they're already familiar with the GRESB assessment process. It also depends what the investable entity is at the end of the day. So it could be that for them, they only want you to report as an investable entity. They're not necessarily interested in the more granular benchmarking information. They just want to have a holistic view. This can really depend. So I guess if you're really not sure, engage with your stakeholders. As I said, typically we would recommend that, as a benchmark, to have more granular benchmarking information is probably best. But of course, at the end of the day, it does also boil down to what resources you have, what you're interested in, and ultimately what your investors want. So yeah, I think that's the only sort of additional advice I can provide at this point in time. But of course, feel free to reach out if you need further clarifications in relation to that. But also, you can also use the sector location matrix, which is one of our resources. So in the case, for instance, that you want to make sure that you have a peer group, or you're interested in understanding, okay, well, how many assets are within this country or within this sector? This is also a pretty useful tool to sort of determine that. So yeah, you can have a scan around, and if you find out that, for instance, oh, well, there's nobody here, it'll take ages to get someone in this benchmark. There's not much point of me breaking it down at this point in time, then that's perfectly legitimate. But in the case there's more than 6 or maybe quite a few in your specific country, like, oh, well, that adds quite a lot of value for me to understand this benchmark information into further detail. So yeah.
Certainly. Hopefully that answers your question, at least partially, Claire, and feel free to reach out to us separately if you have a very specific situation that you want to run across us for advice. And obviously, there's no hard and fast rule. There's so many different situations, especially in infrastructure. That's why we keep that flexibility as well, and we're not too prescriptive on that front, because we know there's different situations, and we want to make sure that the assessment is useful to you and not too specific and one size fits all, in an unhelpful way. So yeah, we'll speak to you perhaps afterwards as well. Right. So in addition to the resources available on our webpage, and have a browse on our website, you can find them under assessments and resources. We also have our training platform, which is a treasure trove of information on the assessments as well. So we launched this last year, which was a very, very fortunate timing in hindsight. And we've updated some of our trainings for this year where relevant. So they're all little videos about how to do certain things in the portal, as well as how certain indicators should be reported on and explaining them. So please have a browse. It's free to enroll, even if you're not registered within the, if you're not registered to report this year, but you're logged into the portal and you want to explore it a bit more, you can still enroll in the training platform. So it's a really good way to explore GRESB reporting. Finally, we have our response check, and this is a good one to raise now because the deadline for that is coming up. So if you are reporting this year and you want to have a bit more of a deeper conversation with our validation team about whether the evidence you've reported is meeting the requirements, whether your assessment is sort of not missing anything very vitally, or you're making a very maybe silly mistake that you hadn't realized, the response check can be very helpful. So you can request that through the portal, and the deadline for that is June 1st. And the response checks will be scheduled before the submission deadline. So it's some point in the next couple of weeks. So yeah, it's especially useful for first year or sort of more junior participants to make sure that you're doing the right things. So please get in touch if you have any questions on that. And speaking of getting in touch, we have an amazing help desk, if I may say so myself, and Fabio is our key infrastructure person. So if you've already been in touch with our help desk recently, you may have gotten a reply from him. So now you can see the face behind the name. But rest assured, we have a large team. So any question, no matter how obscure or how simple, we can probably answer it. And if we can't, then we will write you a new reference guide. I'm joking. We do like your feedback a lot. It's very helpful for us, and it does inform the work that we do. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. You can do so via the contact form on our website, and we aim to respond within 2 business days. So please do so. So as a final reminder, the deadlines: response check 1st of June, and the submission deadline 1st of July at midnight Pacific Standard Time. So hopefully this webinar was helpful to you, and you're now feeling a little bit more confident about your reporting this year. And if you have any questions, like I said, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And thank you very much to the panel for being here today, and for you for attending. And I hope you have a really nice day, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.